The NES versus the Master System. Which is better? This should be a fairly straightforward, non-controversial topic, shouldn't it? Yes, I'm going to try and settle this once and for all, but I am going to try and keep it as objective as possible. I'm just going to talk about tech specs, which is the most powerful. I'm not going to get bogged down in anything else. I'm not going to worry about if Sonic is better than Mario. I'm just going to talk about power. Well then, you're probably thinking, that's easy. If it's going to be that kind of party, then it's the Master System, isn't it? It had the edge over the NES in power, surely. It had more colours and stuff, didn't it? Well, it's not quite so simple, but yeah, the Master System has to be the favourite in this battle as we enter it. But before we get to that, today's video is sponsored by Idle Firefighter Tycoon. If I was a firefighter tycoon, is that a thing? It must be. If I was a firefighter tycoon, I'd be an idle one, certainly. But this game is all about idle in a slightly different sense. Idle in the sense that even when you are offline, it continues to work and make in-game money for you when you get back to it. Just launched is Live Ops, that lets players complete weekly in-game events from Mondays to Sundays, where players can build up their fire stations in a tropical paradise. But wait, there's more. There's new content. You can now play in 2 cities with 3 fire stations each, and as well as fire trucks, you can even take charge of ambulances to help fight emergencies. And there's new emergencies too, not only fires in the city but also in the tropical paradise, with fireboats to fight fires, and solving emergencies rewards you with chests to open. So download it today, the link is in the description. It's on Android, it's on iOS, go and have a look, help support this channel and click that link. So thank you to Idle Firefighter Tycoon, and with that out the way, let's dive right into the heart of things and get straight to the reason why I suspect most people would give the SMS the edge in this fight. It's all about colour. Yes, if you've gone into this video convinced that the Master System is undeniably more powerful than the NES, then this is probably the reason why. It's just more colourful. This is the one obvious feature that is really unambiguously no arguments better in the Master System, and by quite a long way. A game like New Zealand Story, one that appeared on both consoles, really brings that home. It's the same thing but more colourful, right? So what exactly are we working with? Let's lay it out. In the red corner we have the NES with a palette of 56-ish colours. It depends on who you ask. Some shades are pretty close and there's some variation between different models, but let's call it 56. And we can have up to 25 of those colours on screen at once. In the blue corner we have the Master System with a total palette of 64 colours, no confusion there, just a straightforward 64, and you can have 31 colours on screen at the same time. Now this doesn't sound like that much of a difference, does it? The Master System has 8 more colours in its palette and can have 6 more on screen. That's not huge. Look at the palettes side by side. The Master System fills in a few gaps, but that's it. You could even argue that the NES has a nicer selection of shades. But there has to be more to it than that. If that was the only difference, these two would be a much more even match and we'd have a tighter race. Now there is one other big difference in colours. You see, the NES is limited in another way. It's not just total colours, but the number of colours per tile that's the key. What do I mean by tile? Well, both the NES and Master System are tile-based systems. Their graphics are made up of blocks 8 pixels high and 8 pixels wide, called tiles. And these tiles make up the 2 elements of the graphics that these systems have: the backgrounds and the sprites, anything that moves independently of the background. Now this is where we find the big difference. Each tile on the Master System can contain up to 16 different colours, but on the NES it's only 4 at most. That's what really separates the colour output of these machines. With the Master System you have 2 separate sets of 16 colours, one for the background tiles and one for the sprite tiles, and each one can contain any combination of the system's 64 colours that you like. Add these two together and you get 31. There's one less because in the sprite palette there's always one colour set to be transparent, where you can see the background underneath the sprites. On the NES it's way more complicated, but let me try and boil it down as much as possible. Backgrounds are split up into blocks of 4 tiles, and within each of these 4 tile blocks you can have one of 4 sets of 4 colours, but with one background colour that's always the same in each set. That's a lot of 4s, isn't it? But this gives us a total of 13 different background colours. For the sprites, tiles can again use one of 4 sets of 4 colours, but this time one of these is always transparent, leaving 3 distinct shades. This gives us 12 sprite colours and 25 on the screen in total, with some major limits. To be fair here, I should point out that quite a few games laid 2 sprites on top of each other, giving up to 6 colours per tile rather than just 3, like Mega Man 4 here. Some games laid sprites over the top of backgrounds too, to add extra colour to bits of the scene. The downside with both of these is that it uses up a sprite that could be used elsewhere, and there's only so many that can appear on the screen at once. But if we're going to talk clever tricks, then we can talk about mid-frame palette swaps on the Master System 2 that allowed the number of potential colours on the screen to be easily doubled. Not that many games used this feature, but Sonic is a notable example. The water effect in this level achieved by switching to a blue palette at the waterline. The NES could potentially do something similar, but in a much more limited way, so yeah, this doesn't help the NES's case. But in short, the big takeaway here should be it's 15 or 16 colours per tile on the Sega Master System and 3 or 4 on the NES. I'm sure for many of you this fact alone means that it's game over, and to be fair, it does make a huge unignorable difference. If we are just talking technical stuff, I could probably, for a lot of people, just stop the video here. And if you want to shut your ears now and not listen to anything else I've got to say, I wouldn't blame you. When you compare like for like on both systems, so often the Master System just looks that bit better for having that extra colour. The NES has more games, definitely. Maybe you could say even has better games, but I think convincing most classic gamers that it was the better system technically would be a tough sell. The Sega does colour better, and you don't need to be an expert to see the difference. Is there any way the NES can fight back? Is there any point in carrying on with this video? Well, perhaps, and it's not just because a longer video will make me more money. So let's talk about the areas where these systems are maybe more evenly matched, and where the NES might be able to steal a march on the SMS if that's possible. Even if the Master System still comes out ahead, the comparison will be interesting. But hey, before I go any further, if you are enjoying this video, can I get you to hit that like button? It does help me out, and subscribe if you haven't already, that would be fantastic. So let's carry on and talk more about sprites. As I've already said, sprites are anything that moves independently of the background, usually player characters, enemies, all that kind of stuff. We've already discussed how colourful they can be, but there's more to consider. Capabilities with sprites were a big deal for classic systems like this. How do they compare? Well, it's much more even this time. In both systems, sprites can either be 8x8 pixels, a single tile, or 8x16, 2 tiles stacked up. With both systems you can have 8 sprites per scanline or horizontal row of pixels, and a maximum of 64 on screen at once. So far so identical, but things diverge a bit here because both systems have their own unique sprite feature. The Master System for its part can boast what's known as sprite zooming. This is not the sophisticated sprite scaling of other systems like the arcade machines of the day. It can just make sprites twice the size, and it affects all the sprites on the same scan line, so you can't zoom individual ones. It's also bugged. On the first version of the Master System graphics chip, the first 4 sprites are zoomed properly, but the others are only stretched vertically. With a bit of memory editing, you can switch it on in many games very easily and see what it actually looks like. To be fair, it's not really a massively useful feature at the best of times, and its glitchiness just adds to that. I've only been able to find one game that actually uses it for real, and that's Earthworm Jim in the status bar. The NES though brings to the table automatic sprite flipping. Sprites can be flipped horizontally and vertically, a very useful feature. Many NES games use this feature a lot. If you want your character to face the other way or whatever, to point in the other direction, this will handle it very easily by flipping a couple of bits without taking up any extra space in the memory. The Master System can't do this. If you want a character that can walk in both directions there, you've got to find a way to fit two sprites into the memory available or come up with some other way of doing it. Now, admittedly, the Master System can flip background tiles and the NES can't, but that opens up a whole can of worms, so I'm going to come back to that. What about other graphical features? What about resolution, the number of pixels on the screen? Both systems have the same horizontal resolution, 256 pixels across, but the vertical resolution of the two is usually quoted as being different, with the NES having 224 lines of pixels and the Master System having 192 for NTSC systems. This means the NES graphics are slightly taller and therefore have a slightly larger visible screen area, though the aspect ratio in this footage makes the difference look a bit larger than it actually is. It actually turns out the Master System did have a higher resolution mode, giving it basically the same vertical resolution as the NES, but very few games used it. In fact, it was just 4 European-only games from Codemasters as far as I can tell, Cosmic Spacehead here being one of them. We could say that the NES wins this one in practice, but it isn't by much. Next, well, let's have a quick look at the CPUs, and I'm going to short-circuit a long and pointless digression without a clear conclusion and just call it even. The NES has a 6502 running at 1.79 MHz or thereabouts, and the Master System has a Z80 or Z80 running at 3.58 MHz. Both vary in PAL systems a bit, but we'll not worry about that. It might sound like the Z80 is the clear winner from the raw numbers, but, well, it's not. The way these chips worked mean that the 6502 was about twice as efficient as the Z80, so even with half the clock speed it ends up about the same. Yeah, there's more to it than that, but I've not found any compelling hard facts that put one above the other, so let's just move on and forget about it. Another area where the NES could just squeak ahead, possibly quite literally, is sound. In this arena, the Master System presents us with the Texas Instruments SN76489. What is that? Well, it's a 4-channel programmable sound generator with 3 square wave channels with 16 volume levels, a noise channel and, well, that's it. This was a very common, if bare bones, sound chip that ended up in a lot of devices, including the ColecoVision and BBC Micro, as well as the Sega. Sonic 2 here shows off what it can do pretty well. Nice, but very typical 8-bit stuff, really. What does the NES have? Well, the same kind of thing, but this time a bit better. It's a 5-channel programmable sound generator with 2 pulse wave channels, a triangle wave channel, a noise channel, and a delta modulation sample playback channel, all with various controllable parameters. Now, if you're not familiar with sound synth technology, this could all well sound like gibberish, but the NES can basically do anything the Master System can, but a bit better. The 2 pulse wave channels are very similar to the Master System's square waves, but with more control over how they sound. The triangle wave is kind of similar again, but sounds different enough to add some more variety. The noise channel, used for all kinds of effects, is a bit more flexible too, giving it more possibilities. And the sample playback channel adds the final touch, even more sonic options like the drums used in Super Mario 3. Okay, the Master System could play back samples too, and not bad by the standards of the time. Used to haunting effect in Alex Kidd The Lost Stars.
Find the miracle ball.
Yeah, that's some good sound effects, but the thing is that it takes up so much CPU power you can't really be doing anything else at the same time. When you play a sample, everything else stops. This is not the case with the NES. Samples, albeit low quality ones, can be worked in with the rest of the music quite easily. We've heard Super Mario Bros. 3 already, and this is Wrecker, and it goes all out with this technique. Have a listen. This is something you won't hear reproduced on the Master System so easily. I can't see how there can be much argument here, the NES is just more capable. But hold on, what about the Master System's FM sound unit, a Japanese only upgrade originally as an expansion module but later built into the Japanese version of the machine itself. This adds the YM2413 sound chip, meaning a massive leap up in sound quality, giving the console sound closer to what you might find in a 16-bit machine of the era. Better than the NES onboard sound anyway, but sadly no machine in the West ever saw this though, not officially. Are we going to count this? And if we do, we should probably count the NES sound add-ons too, none of which left Japan either, but there were quite a few. Well, hold that thought, because this is a topic I will come back to, and in some detail, but let's just say for now, outside of Japan, the NES wins this one. Where else can we go? Well, wherever else you look, it seems like the Master System is ahead, is more powerful. Both systems can easily handle multi-directional scrolling at the full frame rate of up to 60 frames per second. Though with the NES, many multi-scrolling games have a very noticeable glitch, the loading seam at one side of the screen, a problem you won't see in 8-bit Sega land. Both systems can split the screen up into separate sections and scroll them at different rates too. The Master System though has a sophisticated scanline counter which keeps track of exactly what part of the screen is being drawn, making splitting it up into multiple parts much easier. It can even go as far as scrolling each scanline individually. The NES is stuck with a much more primitive system that only allows one split, so the Master System takes it again. When it comes to RAM, the Master System has 8 kilobytes, the NES has just 2. This memory is what the system uses to store the game's state, what's happening at any given moment. More memory here tends to make for more sophisticated games, though that's not always a guarantee, but a win for the SMS, I think. We've talked about sprite tiles, but what about background tiles? The NES can have up to 512 unique tiles on the screen at once. A win for the NES maybe, because the Master System can only handle up to 448 at most. The thing is though, as I've said before, not only do we have the very obvious advantage of colour, the Master System can automatically flip background tiles horizontally and vertically. They're not each unique, but 448 tiles become 1792 when you can flip them. Not only that, but the Master System's video RAM makes loading new tiles in from the cartridge or even creating new ones in software pretty easy. Looks like the Master System takes this one too. The Master System has to be the ultimate winner, doesn't it? That can be the only conclusion. You can't escape that fact. It's close to evenly matched in many areas, but blows the NES out the water in so many others, particularly colour. You could say the Master System was a souped up version of the NES. Sega knew what they were doing. The NES was the console they had to beat, and they took what it had and improved on it. It wasn't enough to gain them market dominance, but they did manage to come up with a console that improved on so many of the NES's shortcomings. The NES, but better. No surprises, we could have called this right at the start. This has been a complete waste of time, but well, that's YouTube, isn't it? Sega wins. End of story, right? Well, there are some things I've glossed over. Some might take issue with some of the things I've said or didn't say. I've not given the entirety of the full story. The NES has some features, some of them are pretty obscure, that I've not mentioned. Not least that it's possible to have way more than 512 graphics tiles on screen at once, and many other boosts, including sound, thanks to enhancement chips. Yeah, that's something I've not really talked about. Extra circuitry in the cartridge that upgrades the system. Could these chips give the NES an edge over the SMS? Should we even count them at all in the reckoning? Is it even fair? Well, I can't fit it all into one video. This is going to be a two-parter. Coming up next, I discuss how enhancement chips kept the NES competitive and helped it at times perhaps do things the Master System could not. So watch out for that, it's on the way. This isn't over. Can the NES claw back technical supremacy from what looks like a total rout in this 8-bit console war? It could still all end up depending on just how fond of colours you are, but that is to come. So I'm going to drift off once again for now, but not for long. Thanks to all my wonderful Patreons, your help is greatly appreciated. If you'd like to join them, that would be smashing. There's a link below, it does help me out. And I'm going to say thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, folks.